Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit. I feel very full and very grateful and very humbled to share this powerful, alive conversation with Marika Clymer with all of you today. It's on the topic of grief, which is such a primal, integral part of human existence, right? I've never met a person who hasn't experienced grief in their lives in some shape or form. And at the same time, from my personal experience, as well as from conversations I've had with members of my communities in the past few years, grief can feel incredibly difficult to work with, to learn from, and to integrate. Grief can make us really question our ideas of reality, our concept of who we are. It can be such a destabilizing experience. And so when Marika announced her upcoming offering, which she beautifully titled The Cartography of Grief, I felt this instant knowing, instant rising in my gut to reach out to her and to record a conversation on the topic of grief. In 2022, I recorded another conversation with Marika. I believe it was episode 15. And that was toward the end of this year-long energy work apprenticeship that I had with her. That conversation was one of the most grounding, expansive conversation. And this conversation you're about to hear is the first that I've had with Marika in real time since we completed that apprenticeship. And so we discussed the evolution of Marika's practice, how I personally have integrated what she's taught me through my experience, through my path into my practice, and most notably, we discussed Marika's exploration of grief in the past year and her experiences, as well as what she is ready to share with others through this offering. So here's a little bit about the offering, Cartography of Grief. Cartography of Grief is a 2-month online journey to explore the landscape of grief in an intimate community that will meet every other Saturday from February 3rd through March 16th. Registration will close on Friday, February 2nd, or when all spots are filled. There's also an optional in-person retreat in March where participants will gather in the forests of Washington State for an opportunity to integrate the journey through an embodied relationship with the land. For more information, I will be sharing a link in the show notes where you can read more and you can explore to see if this offering resonates with you. And if this is the kind of exploration as well as support that you are craving for at this moment. There's also this really beautiful paragraph that Marika wrote along with the Instagram post when she was announcing this offering that I want to read for you. And it's written in first person. And so imagine this in Marika's voice. I want to hold the space with every ounce of love and presence and tenderness in my heart. I want to walk alongside others as we tend and explore our grief together. That while this path through the forest feels quite dark, I have found a lantern. I am not the lantern maker, nor the candle maker. I'm quite certain it wasn't even I who lit the candle. But I have this lantern in my hands, and I would like to invite others to walk alongside me so that we can all see our individual paths through grief and find our way home, whatever that means. I just thought that was so beautiful and wanted to make sure that I read that for you. And before we get into this conversation, here's a little bit about Marika. Marika Clymer was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest and spent her childhood hunting and fishing alongside her dad throughout the Snohomish County and the greater Puget Sound area. Marika feels that her upbringing gifted her the framework of energetic ecology, where she blends energetic medicine with ecological perspectives. She has dedicated her life to this endeavor with over a decade as a healing practitioner, 7 years in agriculture, a bachelor's degree in environmental studies, and a lifetime of gallivanting through the woods. Her knowledge and expertise is woven throughout many subjects, including Reiki and energy cultivation practices, agricultural mycology, wilderness survival, sustainability, wild plants and fungi, and much more. Marika provides personal healing sessions, mentorships, and opportunities that help bridge the modern divide between body and land. All right, here's my conversation with Marika Clymer. Welcome to the podcast, Marika. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a while since you and I connected, and it just feels so special. The last 10-15 minutes that you and I have been talking, I've just I've missed you.
I
Thank you
know.
for being here.
I have all of the soft and cuddly feelings right now. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So last time you were here, I think we were talking, it's been, wow, like a year and a half. And we were talking about your practice. At that time, I think you were newly working with the concept, the idea, the being of energetic ecology. And I kind of thought maybe that's a nice place for us to start to pick back up on. I'm curious to hear how your own practice and your private and professional practice and your teaching have evolved since then. And maybe before we jump into that, I'm thinking about my podcast etiquette here. In case people don't know you, maybe any words you want to share to introduce people to you, to your voice, and then maybe I'll chime in there too about some of the ways that you and I have been connected, and our relationship.
yes. It's funny because I was actually just talking to Eric about this. They were like about marketing and stuff like that. And they were like, I forgot that it's okay to like reintroduce yourself, Like sometimes I think we feel like um I don't know, that everybody kind of like if we were to do that, it would be annoying somehow, or like people already know who we are or whatever. But I think even when you have cultivated a community or a following on social media, it's okay to like restate your intentions even to that space. It's kind of like the same thing as waking up in the morning and be like, wow, I'm really blessed, like it's not redundant at all. And so thank you for this opportunity to reintroduce myself to the world and
Yeah.
perhaps introduce myself for the first time to other listeners who do not know me. Um, my name is Marika or Marika. And I am a person who is from the Pacific Northwest. Um, I feel like I identify most and am most vocal about being from this beautiful place and having grown up here. When I think about my practice and the reason my practice has evolved the way that it has is 100% due to that connection and, to this land. And I owe this land, my gratitude for creating energetic ecology through me. And I think something I actually just rewrote like my bio for my website. And one of the things that I wrote was, and this, might give people the ick, but, and would have for me, at a time in my life, but this idea of like my identity kind of being a juxtaposition between East and West.
Mm,
Having my mother's lineage from Asia, coming and immigrating here to the United States, and
mm,
having my father's lineage be here from literally from the Pacific Northwest, actually since like the 1840s. We
wow.
learned after he passed, yeah, and that's a
Uh,
whole crazy thing.
uh-huh.
Um, yeah, I have a different last name than I thought I did, which maybe we'll talk about that after the.
What?
I know, it's crazy. Yeah, because yeah. So I don't know. Maybe I'll say it, like my grandfather was adopted, which I guess we already knew that. So I already knew somehow that we had a different last name.
Mm,
Um, but it's like my dad always had these like stories that he would tell, and some of them you're just like, is there really any like merit to this? I mean, he's
yeah.
a that there's a reason why they call it like fisherman's tales, or uh the whole movie Big Fish is about this idea, right? um but and even when I looked up on ancestry.com, it said that Everett was adopted by, these people with the last name Clymer, or that he was not adopted, that he was born to these people from the
Mm.
Clymer family. So he was always a Clymer. That's my last name. For folks who do not know. And when my dad passed, we found a box of stuff that said the original adoption papers from uh, Douglas County, Oregon,
Mm.
1920, that said this child, Everett Crow, will be adopted by so and so Clymer. And the reason was because, and this is why I want to tell this story, is because people that know me know that I like to be a little rootin' tootin', Wild West girly. The reason why he was surrendered to the state of Oregon was because his father was sentenced to 20 years in prison.
Wow.
Yeah. So my whole little thing is like, oh, I've always kind of had this outlaw spirit, but now I really can see, which, it's like, this is probably more information than the internet needs to know. But I think it's awesome. And it's also, maybe we could spin it into a lesson that like, you really don't know
Mhm,
where you come from. You don't
mhm,
like, and it also, I've always felt really like when I've visited Oregon, I've spent a lot of time in Oregon throughout my life. Like a lot, from childhood to adulthood. But I've really enjoyed connecting with it for extended periods of time, over the past 10 years, I would say. I'll go to Oregon once or twice, well, multiple times a year to visit family,
mm,
but also just to camp and, be outside and collect plants and all of that stuff. But I always felt like this really visceral connection to it.
mm,
And I didn't really realize that like that actually made a lot of sense, because after my father passed, I realized like, oh, everyone on my father's side is buried in Oregon. Like I'm actually, more Oregon than I am Washington.
mm,
I think my father's parents moved up here to the Seattle area in maybe the 40s.
mhm,
Um, but I guess I didn't, you don't think about that kind of stuff when you're younger, like, oh, maybe my grandma and grandpa are actually from a different place,
mm.
whatever. So, yeah. that feels very special to me, my
Mhm.
connection to that place.
Mhm.
About me, what about me? I don't know. Gosh, I like to play with plants. I like to make things with plants. I have been an energy healer for 10 years.
Mhm.
Um, if not a little bit more at this point, maybe 11 years actually, 11
Mhm.
years as of January, which is
Mhm.
right now.
Mhm.
So, um, what other things do I do? I play music. Um, I worked as a farmer for about 7 years.
Mhm.
Um, I'm just kind of like listing all of the various things that I do for income because
Mhm.
I really kind of like that I get to juggle multiple things.
I like that too. Mhm.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Mhm.
Yes, I'll just leave it there. I'm a mother.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I also am kind of I can't move on from this idea of crow because I
Mm.
have also seen on your Instagram, I think, or maybe you've sent this to me privately, your crow tattoo. And like,
Yeah,
how wild was that? Was
I
that before or after the
that was
revelation?
that was way before. So that was in July that I think I did that tattoo. Also, if people want to know, I've been tattooing. I'm trying to like make that a thing. Because I feel like that will be a more stable income stream than anything else that I do, like more
Mm,
inflation proof. People are going to buy tattoos. People want tattoos. People that have money, even people that don't have money, they want tattoos. And, I'm over here I just, anyways. So, um, yeah, that the first off, I was gifted a actually like a taxidermy stuffed crow
mm,
um from this guy that I was dating actually in July. And when I was tattooing the crow on myself, I was sitting right underneath the crow. I can actually see it from right here. And I don't know if
mhm.
you've seen it. You've seen it. Yeah. So
Yeah.
um, right up
Wow.
there. Her name is Cheryl Crow. Um, but yeah, and so I was like looking up at the crow while I was tattooing a crow on myself. And like I'm not really like a crow has not been like, a quote unquote spirit animal for me.
Mm, mhm, mhm.
I think crows are cool, but it just I don't know why I just felt compelled to that's the way the design came out was the crow. Um, the first tattoo that I did on myself was an eagle skull, and
Mhm.
that's pretty sweet. But yeah, the crow. And then a couple months later, learning that my last name was Crow. Um,
Wow.
well, I guess I was born a climber, and my father was always very proud to be a climber because I
Mm,
don't know, climber name, whatever. You know,
mhm.
uh, men men are very there's something about names and ownership and all of that stuff. But yeah, it's pretty cool to learn that my last name was Crow. And for anybody who's like, is she native? No, no, actually, I am not. It comes from the etymology. So first off, Crow is a very common name throughout Europe, I guess.
Mm, mm,
In Britain, England, the UK, the United Kingdom. But for my lineage specifically, being German on my father's side,
mhm.
among a few other things, were German and French and Ukrainian. Um, Crow is like Kroh and in German, and it indeed means crow. So
Mm.
for what it's worth.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm also amazed by just the fact that, I think sometimes when we talk about intuition in the spiritual world, we kind of make it this big thing, right? But I actually think that the intuition I've been tracking the most these days are the kinds that show up in my body or through my action without me even thinking about it and without me pre-planning it and without there being some sort of significant vision around it where I'm just like, I just did the thing, and then turns out this was actually really meaningful to me and my lineage. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I agree. I think that that is, yes, there's always this big emphasis on like making intuition a practice, which
Mm.
it absolutely is. Like there are forms of intuition that you can turn into skills and cultivate those skills. But then when it comes to like the ancestral stuff, I just feel like you said, like it is unplanned, it is spontaneous, it is, like you said, it's just like things that you found yourself doing. And then, months later, you find out that, I don't know, you find out one thing or another, and you're like, oh,
Hmm.
okay,
Hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. Um, I'm also wanting to have you talk a little bit about energetic ecology because somehow in my mind there's a connection there. When we're thinking about our body is part of the land, right? And
Yeah.
also, um, there's something here about the terrestriality of spirituality that I think sometimes when we think about spirituality, we think only about the spirit part, right? But
Right.
if it's just the spirit and it's not kind of ensconced and brought into the earthly vessel of the land as well as the body, then what even is it? I mean, I don't even know. I can't even contextualize from my human body how that would feel. I don't know if there's a question there, but I think, yeah, maybe to have you talk a little bit about energetic ecology and
Mhm.
how that's evolved since I last studied with you. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Well, I think that kind of in this vein, or following this thread of like intuition, right?
Mm.
Um, that mm, it's almost like I was practicing what I call energetic ecology for so many more years before I called it energetic ecology,
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually being able to, like, in the process of learning how to teach other people my practice, I had to articulate it, right? In
Mm.
order to teach people something, you have to like be able to verbally walk someone through it. At least, when it comes to like especially like online, right? Like how are we supposed to teach if we're not talking and speaking and writing, and reading?
Mm.
Um and I think that hmm a big thing that comes up for me is talking about this four element system and how in I don't even know what I'm fucking talking about. um, let's see here. I'm kind of being stumped right now, Jonathan, and
Mm.
we're gonna get through it. We might have to cut it. It's okay.
That's the magic. Let's explore this together. Yeah. And I can also, if you feel like you want to talk to, because okay, so let me put it this way, Marika. I think this is really interesting. Maybe it's nice to talk about our relationship a little bit too here, and let's see if we want to keep this in the recording. But um, when I first came to you, it was essentially a Reiki mentorship, right?
Yeah.
The container was a Reiki mentorship. And then halfway
Listen.
through, we shifted into energetic ecology. Although, in
Yeah.
my opinion, you've always been teaching us energetic ecology
Yeah.
in a way, right? And then, after we were complete with that program, it took me some time to integrate what you had taught us conceptually as well as practically. And I think what I've experienced in my own lived being is that this practice, this framework that you taught us, has really helped me kind of bring everything together. Recently, I was actually talking to our friend Tiana from my cohort, and we were talking about how, I'm just going to speak for myself, how for me, I'm someone who has always been drawn to different modalities. And there was always this part of me, Marika, that is always wondering, like, am I a fraud? You know, because like I would like study something and then I would need to move to a different modality. I would have to take this really sharp left turn without having completed what I learned. And then I would come back to it later. And it almost feels to me like my path has been this broken lineage of collecting different pieces.
Yeah.
And then last year, yeah. And then last year, I realized something that was pretty profound, Marika. And I think it was actually happening when I was doing your hara breathing. So this is why I wanted to bring this to you.
That's what I want to hear. I want to hear that people are actually doing the things that I do.
Right. I realized we live in a broken world.
Yeah.
A lot of our spiritual practices came to us from broken lineages.
Yes.
It would be dishonest to try to recover some sort of purity around that. And that I feel like this framework of energetic ecology is so profound because it's very multidimensional. What I experienced with it was just using myself as an example, right? My ancestors came from ancient China, moved to a bunch of different places. My parents landed in Indonesia, and I grew up in Indonesia for about 17 years, you know, with that particular perspective and that particular context, right? And then I moved here for music school when I was 17 to New York, and I've stayed here ever since, even though my brain is always telling me to get out of New York. I would always plot my escape, Marika, and then it wouldn't happen. The plan would fall through, right? And what I've learned from all of that is, you know, to kind of go back to what you were saying earlier, this meeting of the East and the West is so fascinating because even that orientation to me is a colonial construct, right? And the truth is, I'm connected to this land because I've lived here now for 16 years, right? They say that every 7 years the cells in our bodies regenerate, right? Yeah. Like we're basically new people. And so in some ways, you know, if we use that framework, I am part of this land right now. I am an extension of this land. But I also have experiences that came from Indonesia because that's where I grew up. And I have DNA of my ancestors who also came from ancient China, you know, which by the way doesn't exist anymore, right? And so I feel like part of also then, you know, living in 2024, all of us kind of connected weirdly through this thing we call the internet, is we are seeing these different pieces of the broken mirror, right? And we're trying to kind of understand it. But I think the opportunity in this time is that we get to weave together something that is a reflection of only what we individually can refract back into the collective, and then kind of bringing it back into the collective and seeing what happens, right? Because my medicine is going to be very different than yours, very different than, you know, our friends Eric, Tiana, or whoever from our cohort, right? And then we kind of come together and ask ourselves, you know, do this really interesting thing of like, what are we doing? Right? I don't know. Curious to hear anything that comes up for you around that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think it definitely helps me come to like maybe an entry point for talking about energetic ecology, which is great.
Hmm.
Um, and I think particularly like that question of like quote unquote East and West and this kind of this forced dichotomy, right?
Yeah.
I say forced and almost like inherited dichotomy because, as you said, like that is kind of a reflection of the like how colonialism makes us or creates divisions in our head between, different places, right?
Hmm.
And how um if we think about our own bodies, particularly as children of immigrants, and this idea of being quote unquote alien, right? That maybe there's this inherent idea that like we can't connect with the land, we can't be a part of this land, that this land is not us also.
Mm.
And I think that there's a lot of kind of similar narratives throughout many communities, um, not just quote unquote colonial kind of understandings of land, right? Um, but I think as far as these broken lineages and kind of putting together these pieces of the mirror, I would say that like there are broken aspects of both sides of my lineage, right? For various
Mm.
reasons. And yet energetic ecology itself the um is my attempt to glue those pieces of the mirror back together so that I can see myself more clearly,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, as far as, kind of the foundational framework or kind of the jumping off point of energetic ecology itself was like me being very like disillusioned about Reiki as a practice here in the quote unquote West, right?
Mm. Mhm.
Um, like so many of us, are. Um, and it was in my attempt to um understand like where Reiki comes from better, like as somebody who, you know, comes from, this kind of broken lineage from Japan itself, right?
Mm.
Uh,
Mhm.
there's
Mhm.
literally an ocean of distance
Mhm.
between myself and like ancestral homelands. And that kind of came into Shinto, of course, which, my mother and my grandmother were practicing Shinto, whether or not I would be able to identify it. I am now. But when you're a kid, they're not like, this is Shinto and this is why,
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but this four element system, right, which is so common around the world, the four element system of, earth, water, fire, air.
Mm.
Um, and it was kind of from that framework that then I was able to blend all of like my very practical, almost tactile, visceral experiences of being outside with my dad, and that like these elemental, like how the spiritual and the natural are kind of together because
Mm.
Shinto itself is animism, right? And it's nature-based animism, like so many traditional cultures around the world, right? No matter where you look. It is all earth-based animism. Um, but when you are coming to it from a modern context, it's very easy to focus on the framework itself rather than the actual like embodied practice of being outside. And I think with my dad, of course, my father was raised Christian. Um, but he wasn't like overtly like capital S spiritual.
Mm.
Um, and his form of spirituality was spending time in nature. And so, being here in the Pacific Northwest, I've been very privileged to have spent more time with rivers than a lot of people, a
Mm,
lot more time with mountains than a lot of people, with trees than a lot of people, with ocean. This land is quite abundant, in so many ways. And so energetic ecology is really, the blend of those two things,
mm,
right? Kind of the more ideological framework of, the four element system, and then the tactile experiences of being outside. um yeah, yeah, and then somehow that all relates to energy healing.
mhm, mhm,
Because then it is through my time outside and through this animist worldview that is very integrated into my body at this point.
mm,
Like it's not something that I try to impress upon myself that trees have spirits, or that, when a gust of wind goes by, being able to experience that from like person to person, almost like being able to glimpse an actual person go by.
mm,
Um, but then applying that to the body. And that, I think, of course, is kind of the point of the program, right? Is like, how do we see nature inside of us?
mm,
Of course,
mm,
and that's not a new concept by any means.
mm.
But I do think that, I don't know, I think that it's helped a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm thinking now as you're speaking about the map that you made us create pretty
Yeah.
early on in that program. And recently I was also um, really drawn to some of your writing about grief and about how grief, in a sense, requires us to redraw our internal and external map, and the map of who we are. And I'm wondering if maybe it's time for us to talk about that in this conversation, to talk a little bit about grief and how we can work with, understand, not just intellectually, but maybe get closer to befriend our grief. And the word that keeps coming back to my mind at this moment is metabolize grief. Like there's something about how grief can feel so big for us and so hard to even approach, that
Mm,
metabolizing grief feels impossible, you know?
sure. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
mhm. I'm gonna pause there and see what comes up for you. Yeah.
I think there's an experience that was kind of like the crux point
Mm,
uh, of what you're talking about as far as grief goes with my father passing. And
mm,
I'll try not to get too emotional talking about it, but we'll see. Which is that, I think one of the big realizations that um, one of the big realizations that I had throughout, like having to lose my father one piece at a time
mm,
over 2 months, was that in order for me to walk through that without completely self-combusting,
mm,
was I was denying myself the right to grieve each piece of my father as I lost those pieces.
mhm,
I kind of thought like, oh, if I have to wait, right? I have to wait till the big grief happens.
Mm.
Otherwise, I'm contributing to, I'm sending energy in that place. And
Mm.
what was happening was I was not metabolizing my grief as it was coming up.
Mm.
I was kind of like, as soon as I would feel it come up, I'd be like, oh, we can't do that right now, you know?
Mm. Mm.
And even as we speak, it's like using my breath to kind of like facilitate grief passing through me
Mm.
without maybe having too much of the physiological response,
Mm.
for the sake of the podcast.
Mm.
um, yeah, I had this moment at the hospital with him where like first, and people don't need to know absolutely everything, but I think it's telling. Like first, my father basically had a surgery that went wrong. And okay, we got this. So first, he lost his breath and he was on life support. And then he lost his voice. Well, he did. He lost his voice the same time he lost his breath, basically. But then, and it's like each time these little things that would happen, I was just like, I'm losing bits and pieces of my father, but I need to kind of keep the lid on the grief,
Mm.
so
Mm.
that it doesn't overflow. And then, I think this was about a week before he passed. Just uh, something happened with what was going on with him.
Mm.
And I walk into his room and I'm like, oh, they moved my father to a different
Mm.
room.
Mm.
And so I was like, I walked out to the nurse's station and I was like, oh, it looks like you guys moved Paul. Like, what room is he in? And she was like, no, no, that's him. So, long story short, my father, became unrecognizable.
Mm.
And I had to watch my mother, go through that too, because I had gotten there first and nobody had given us any warning.
Mm.
Um, but then, you know, I had my moments. I went through that. There's, some processes and some exercises that I did to kind of handle myself in that moment, which is part of like what I want to share with everybody,
Mm.
in the program, I guess. I don't know. I hate calling things
Mm.
programs and courses and da 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 da. But
Mm.
in cartography of grief. But when I left the hospital, I was just completely obliterated, as a person.
Mm.
And for those who don't know, I have been a tobacco smoker I was a smoker for 12 years. I was at a pack a day for probably 2 years.
Mm.
And that's a whole like conversation within itself.
Mm.
Totally a whole like very big spiritual, revelation around that. But I quit smoking. And I about, I don't know, maybe a couple weeks before this happened, and then I also, because I quit smoking, and I haven't really ever had a drinking problem or anything like that, but I was just like, even if I'm having a couple drinks a month, I know what that is like. I feel the difference in my body when I do. So let's just
Mm.
quit drinking.
Mm.
And when I got out of the hospital, I was like, I need a cigarette and I need some whiskey. And
Mm.
I was just like, just fucking losing it, like really coming apart at the seams. And I think for those who know like my mental health history, I really mean coming apart at the seams. Um, and but I was like, I can't have those things. So how can I give myself dopamine right now? And I was like, okay, we're gonna go and get pizza. So I went and got pizza. And you know, I and then when I got home, so this is the point, is that after that happened, I got home to my home and I like started entering psychosis basically. And and I was starting to realize through that process. So I, started noticing what was happening, kind of like alert, 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 and, did all of these different practices that I've kind of developed to manage my mental illness and was able to kind of walk myself back from the edge a little bit. But then from there came all of the processing. And specifically all of the processing that I haven't done because I was afraid to grieve each little piece of my father.
Yeah. Yeah.
And realizing that it was me not metabolizing that grief in the moment and letting it build up and build up and build up to this moment of like complete just fraying at all of, the threads of who I was as a person, and kind of realizing that because I wasn't, allowing myself to go through this physiological process of grief, that it had to come, in this moment, not being able to recognize my father. And from there, it was kind of like, I don't know, from there, it was just, that was really a turning point for me that made me really understand grief from a whole new place. And I think in this kind of vein of these incomplete physiological processes, these incomplete like metabolic processes, how we actually do like digest, our cells digest grief, right? What kind of came as a revelation to me that day after I was able to kind of come back to a place of regularity, was this idea that like grief itself is kind of a neutral energy. I don't mean like neutral in the fact of like, I don't know, like blah or gray or, whatever, but grief itself is neutral in the way that any other emotion is kind of neutral. I'm not doing the best way of describing this, but that it's an energy that we channel, right? Grief is, if our body is the riverbed, our emotions are the river that pass through that riverbed, right? And grief is no more or less significant than any other emotion that passes through us. It's all water. Joy, sorrow, bereavement, anger, frustration, confusion, desolation, hopelessness, all of these things are just water flowing through the riverbed, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, and there's different ways that our body can respond to that energy to allow it to pass through us. It's not that we can't, like, I don't know. I feel like when we're talking about these particular energies or emotions as energies and energy as emotions, I want to say that it's not so simple. Like, we're not also just like this passive vessel in the process, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
that like when grief passes through us, we are irrevocably changed by
Mm,
that process.
mhm,
Um, but just understanding grief as an energy that is meant to flow through us, like that is what the physiological process is kind of dependent on, metabolic process, emotional process is our ability to allow that energy to pass through us.
mm,
When we don't allow that energy to pass through us, and this is to say for all emotions, not just grief, it can stop short, and it can, maybe its pathway is blocked in some way, and it can't fully pass through us, you
mm,
know. And that is where we kind of get um, illness and disease. So
mm,
the reason why I say this is because during that process of like, um, in the process of grieving or in shock, there's a lot of different words that we can use. I was tracking where my breath was going,
mhm,
and it was stopping like right at like my upper lungs. So I wasn't actually fully taking in air
mhm,
into my chest.
mm,
My body wasn't actually fully going through the physiological process that it needed to process that moment,
mhm.
and therefore process that grief in the moment, or
Mm.
that shock, disbelief, whatever in the
Yeah,
moment.
yeah.
And I think that it was just a really big teaching moment for me.
Mm,
Um, and from there, it kind of, it goes into these elemental understandings of grief as well, and how, grief itself or any kind of emotion itself is also associated with different elements. Um, there's a lot of different things, and like how our body processes grief is can be very similar to how our parents process grief, how our
mm,
grandparents process grief, right?
mhm,
That there are physiological responses that can be involuntary based
mm,
off of any trauma that we might have. And, hereditary patterns, genetic patterns, the same for trauma. People like, the books like The Body Keeps the Score, and The Unspoken Voice, and all of these, or My Grandmother's Hands. It's very much in the collective understanding and awareness that ancestral trauma, impacts how we ourselves experience circumstances that dysregulate our nervous system and our body, and we can respond to it in the same way that our parents did, right?
mm,
And it
mhm,
can, similarly, that trapped energy in the body can result in similar illness and disease,
mm,
that
mhm.
that then we call hereditary, you know,
Yeah.
right? And so, yeah, it was just a really big turning point for me in my understanding of all of these things. And,
Mm,
you know, I will say that I am not by any means done grieving. Even me talking about this with you, like that
mm,
is me grieving in the moment.
yeah.
And just as I just described, there was a moment, it passed through me. I
Mhm,
breathed through it, let my
mm,
body like take in the air that it needed, so that literally the grief could like come down into and pass through my lungs instead of stopping short. What I was going to say
mm,
about that was,
mhm,
I actually, at the same time that my father was going through this and I was not grieving properly,
mm,
I dealt with a very severe lung infection.
mm,
Yeah. And
mhm,
it's funny. I mean,
mhm,
I don't know if you can call it funny, but the reason why my father was in the hospital to begin with was because of breathing issues, lung issues, not hereditary, but more, I guess, experiential.
Yeah.
The word is not coming to me right now, but circumstantial,
Mm-hmm.
rather than hereditary. And
Mm-hmm.
the surgery resulted in 2/3 of one of his lungs erupting and then having to be removed because of that eruption. And so it seemed very kind of poetic in a way for me to be dealing with a lung infection at that time. But in Chinese medicine specifically, grief is associated with the lungs. So it's just,
Mm-hmm.
it's all so blatantly obvious, right? It's just like,
Mm-hmm.
of course I'm
Mm-hmm.
dealing. And that is also to say that, like, there are other actual circumstantial reasons as to why, I've been dealing with lung issues for chronically for the last number of years. And I attribute that to mushroom farming, unfortunately, and just breathing in spores and having kind of a overreactive immune system and da 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 da.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the smoking doesn't help either.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's just interesting how blatantly, like I said, blatantly obvious that connection was like I was not processing my grief. I was not
Mm-hmm.
allowing myself to go through that actual process on so many different levels. And it was directly and very immediately resulting in me being physically impacted by my
Mm-hmm.
own grief.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and perhaps not really being able to see that until I had that day that I had described to you. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah, yeah. So, yeah.
Mm. Mm. What's coming up for me, Marika, is also how sometimes I think the fear of going there
Yes.
is coming from an awareness on some level
Yeah.
that what we're dealing with is also more than just what's ours to digest, right? Like
Yeah.
what I'm hearing from you too is that so much of this grief that you were maybe kind of moving through was ancestral too, and I'm going back to a conversation that to a little point within our last conversation that has really stuck with me, which was you had asked this question of, being a healer and whether we even have control or agency over what we move through, and is our body really ours when we're a healer? And I've been thinking a lot and thinking seriously about that question since our last conversation, because to me, where I'm landing with that is that on the one hand, yes, I do think we can practice having agency and boundaries, which you and I talked about right before we recorded this. And also, I think part of our service can be metabolizing some of these
Yeah.
more collective experiences, right? That is absolutely also has a personal component to it,
Hmm.
but is often intertangled within a web of bigger
Yeah.
systemic phenomenon energetically,
Yeah.
and I think what what is both a blessing and a curse to, let's just say, for simplicity's sake, right, of being a healer or having stepped into this path, is that we get access to that which others don't always have the tools to deal with, right?
Yeah.
The tools to see. And I think sometimes that access can make it more intense, because
Yeah.
then you see something and you're not always validated by the people around you that this is happening, right? And I also just want to say, I can't find the right words for it, so I'm going to say it imperfectly, but I'm really grateful that you shared that with us and that you shared that with me. And yeah, I'm really sorry for your loss. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
thank you for having me here to be able to share that. I hope it wasn't too much, but
Mm.
I think that there's definitely, while there are these I agree that we do oftentimes as healers process, right,
Mm-hmm.
for the collective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is also why we have to be really protective of our energy,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
I think that with this particular circumstance with my father, um, part of me was really hoping that because I was getting a lung infection too, that maybe I was like kind of taking away some of that burden from
Mm.
him.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe I was thinking to myself, like, I need to be really careful about my energetic hygiene every time I'm walking into the hospital,
Mm-hmm.
which is like a really good practice to do. And
Mm.
at first, I really was very diligent about it. But then when I started kind of developing these really like alarming respiratory symptoms, part of me, like I said, was just like, well, fuck the energetic hygiene. If I can take some of this on so that my father can live, like give it all to me,
Mm.
And I think,
Mm.
a lot of us feel that way
Yeah.
about things that we see in the world. Um, but yeah, yeah, I agree. And I think that I appreciate you holding this space for me. And I hope that when people listen to it, that it's not my grief that they're taking on, but
Mm.
perhaps, maybe it's stirring up their own grief, if
Mm-hmm.
anything, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
um, because I think in holding, but then at the same time, it's like, I don't know, it's like I'm going to be holding this space for people who are grieving.
Mm-hmm.
And like, yes, we all should practice energetic hygiene around that, but also like it's kind of not the point to just go through the program and grieve alone, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. I
yeah.
I think a lot about this, Marika. And I also have been playing with that boundary, right? Because I do feel like sometimes when we're doing these deeper works, it becomes a living, and I really pick this word carefully and respectfully, it becomes a living laboratory, right? Of like a bigger pattern that is happening in the world. Like we are the world. We're
Yeah.
not separate, right? And so when we come together bound by similar commitment to moving something through,
Hmm.
there is always, I've been questioning this idea of like a safe space, right? Because is that even the point? I think that the point is to deal with it. The point is to look at it, right? And I hope that doesn't sound scary, because I think denial is scarier,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely.
Right? Like
Absolutely.
not looking at it is scarier and maybe has um, all the unsavory implications we see now in the world is because we don't deal with it. And I just also want to express to you that, to me, I invited you into this open space of this podcast because that is the space that we are co-creating here, and I welcome it all. I don't think, I really believe that folks listening have discernment, and
Yeah.
when they click on an episode, they know that it's, this is, there's potency, because the work that we are putting out here is the work of our lives, right? And
Hmm.
it's not, it comes from every single thing that my guests as well as myself brought into this project is an extension of our lives. It's not the entirety, right? But it's what we've learned and what we have sacrificed in terms of make sacred through walking our path, you know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one thing that what you were saying kind of inspired within me was this idea of like, or I guess maybe one thing I want to go back to is your kind of your statement about us taking things on again,
Mm-hmm.
which is, or like, you know, collective. I think that, and I believe that most people kind of know this, or at least kind of in our kind of sphere of the spiritual world, this idea that like we're meant to grieve collectively, and that like it is the very fact that like in a patriarchal culture there is so much rejection of grief as a process, um that, you know, traditionally these moments are held in community, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And I don't know, I felt like that was kind of important to share too.
Yeah.
uh, Being very, I don't know, grateful for that process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What's coming up for me is also this recognition, right, that a lot of what it means, at least for me personally, doing this work together is that we actually gain more clarity around what is ours to transmute and what are not ours to transmute. Because we also, as one human being, right, as one body, we can't oftentimes transmute it all. And I think the desire to transmute everything or heal everything is also coming from this perfectionist lens, right? That sometimes, that I think we've been indoctrinated into, you know, and the reality is that, we have limited capacity, and also we get to, what a gift, you know, to get to move that energy with one another, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also, I just want to share with you my experience too of hearing your experience, and your sharing of that experience was, it helped me reflect on the times when, like, the different ways that I've worked with grief throughout my life, right? And there are maybe times where that process was a bit more easeful, and then other times where that process felt completely impossible, right? And it helped me reflect on how I was walking alongside grief, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. And yeah, there's also something here that I kind of want to bring up in case it brings something up for you too, Marika, which is, I think there's something about our relationship and the power dynamics that we have within different communities, right? That sometimes makes some of these processings challenging, you know, because we have certain expectations, right, of like what community members, what roles they can play for us, or what our teachers' roles are. And I think, yeah, I don't know if there's something there to contemplate between the two of us, but I'm really curious what that's bringing up for you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think a big thing that comes up for me, and this is also to kind of go back to your point of like people are adults, and like we can put a little, maybe like a little trigger warning at the beginning of the episode, like, hey, you know, there's some big stuff in here.
Yeah.
And people can make a more informed decision and consent to, having, a heavier kind of conversation about grief. But it
Mm.
is about grief. So, I mean, what do you really expect?
Yeah.
But this idea of like boundaries,
Mm.
boundaries. And I think that those of us who like identify as healers, or space holders in general, people pleasers, we lack boundaries. We want to take things on for other people. And I will say that, like, to your point of power dynamics, and just like, I wouldn't even necessarily, at least for, where I'm going to steer this, like, not so much about power as just like roles, right?
Mm. Mm.
Um, when I facilitate these spaces, like, it's big, right? Like that shit knocks me out for like 2 days after, you know? Because I do have to like show up and almost like just literally, pull energy from somewhere, I don't know where, to show up for people in this really rooted, grounded way. And being
Mm.
able to hold that space so that people do feel safe
Mm.
to let energy and let emotions move through them.
Mhm.
And I think that, yeah, there are different considerations for um, just how we grieve, who we let see us grieve,
Mm.
how we take on other people's grief, um, or just emotions in general. I think that, especially like with social media, there is not a whole lot of awareness around, like, I don't know. I just feel like a lot of the time I open up something and I'm like, whoa, like there's something that this person, is kind of exploding out into the world. And I don't know if I really consented to that, but again, like coming back to the thought about boundaries, and just, I don't know, understanding our own capacity
Mm.
and what work is ours versus
Mm.
what can be collectively held. I mean, ultimately, all of our work, all of our grief work is ours, right? Like
Mhm.
nobody else can do that for us. That is energy that has to pass through our body.
Yeah.
But we can also be standing side by side with other people while they also do that work for themselves.
Mm.
I don't
Mhm.
know.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Or at least we can practice that, right? I think that's what I'm
Yes,
thinking
so
about in this moment. We can practice, we can commit to practicing that alongside others. And yeah, I think grief also has its own timeline sometimes, and um part of that um part of the boundaries you're talking about too, I think, has to do with respecting the boundaries of the energy of grief that wants to move through us. Because in my experience, for example, with grief, it likes to show itself in drips to me.
mm,
You know, um,
mm,
I so appreciate, and I think I'm still kind of in this process of inquiry, or my body is in this process of inquiry right now, hearing your experience, because I'm realizing for me, I don't know what it is, Marika, but it's like the way that my body wants to work with it in small drips, right? And it's very discerning, and it tells me like, okay, we don't go there, or we go there right away, right? Like it kind of shows me, and I think a lot of
mm,
my work around grief has been um, allowing myself to collaborate with grief, to be worked on by grief, grief as a teacher, right? And grief as, um, actually grief as a spirit worker is kind of the phrase that's coming up for me, because it is, it does put me on this path, put me on this process that sometimes I don't get a say as to how long that's going to take, you know?
Yeah.
And I think honoring that too, like there are times when I work with the entity of grief, it literally tells me like I need, the door needs to be shut right now. Like this
Mm.
is as far as you're gonna go. This is as far as you're going to metabolize the medicine that I'm giving to you right now. Come back in 3 months. Right? There is that too, you know, and it's a very specific way in which I know my system
Right.
operates, right? But for me, learning how to not exploit those moments and
Yeah.
make it bigger than what it already is, without also falling into um, repression,
Yeah.
is kind of the line, right? That I think there's a line that we're walking there that can be really challenging.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
I well, and I think that I appreciate this more animist perspective,
Mm,
about grief
mm,
and it being a spirit that does move through us.
mm,
We talk about the Holy Ghost. Let's talk about the
mm,
Holy Ghost of grief.
mm, mm,
Um, and I also think that this is kind of something that I'm really excited about is like literally the energetic ecology of grief and how,
mm,
our bodies as ecosystems are all different.
mm,
And, similarly, like not just how grief as a teacher teaches all of us differently, but like how our bodies teach us to channel this energy. Um, is also, you know, a spirit within itself, like our body teaching us, and also like, our body as as a representative of like the ancestral spirits, and
mm,
our ancestral communities and what they want to teach us about grief, right?
mhm,
Um, it's not even I also, I want to say that like grief isn't I think that, our conversation thus far for me, I've kind of been talking about grief as if um like we're just meant to process it and then it's over and we don't have
mm,
to, but that's
mhm,
so far from it. It's like I want to grieve my father for the rest of my life.
mm,
I do. Like, I feel like if I'm a little afraid of like, if I stop grieving him, even for a moment, that means that my love for him has diminished in some way.
mm,
And so I think for me personally, um, befriending grief
mm,
and understanding that I get to have a lifelong relationship with grief now.
mhm,
Um, as a teacher, as a friend, as a companion, um, and you know, kind of how we in our in our cohort did our kind of collective spirit body assignment and creating this
mm,
collage of like who is this spirit that like is a collection of all of these different aspects of ourself and the world around us. Similarly, like who is this person that is grief and how are they um this spirit that is fed by so many different things.
mm,
um because I do think that in this vein of like the animism of it, um I think that's kind of what I mean by like quote unquote neutral energy, because in animism and like specifically like Shinto, there isn't this understanding of good and evil in a Western Judeo context of like
mhm,
ascribing morality to different personality traits or different spirits. Like there's no such thing as like this evil spirit, so to speak, in the same way
Mm-hmm.
that we would kind of understand the quote unquote devil in the Christian sense, right?
Yeah.
And so within an animist landscape, different spirits are just different energies moving and navigating around it, and sure, manipulating their environment and, maybe causing some mischief, but it's not, they're neither bad nor good. And in
Mm,
the same way, these energetic spirits of emotions, similarly are neither bad nor good. And I will say that, like, grief may not only be a companion or a friend. Like, we can also have a very toxic relationship with grief. And I think,
mm,
or have a repressive relationship with grief. And,
yeah.
there's all of these different ways that
Mm,
grief can manifest itself, right?
mm,
Um, and and it's all up to us, like how we choose to be in relationship with grief.
mm,
um and for those of us that have lost folks, and that is the source of our grief, our relationship with the dead. And that's a whole other thing, right? Because there's like a lot of folks who have like ancestral grief where they're not really grieving something that is in their like
lifetime.
direct impact sort of thing. There's
Mm-hmm.
grieving the loss of loved ones. There is collective grief. There are all of these different ways that grief shows up. And yeah, I don't know. Where do we go from there?
Mm-hmm. Mm. I love that, Marika. Thank you for um, kind of laying that out, because I do feel like that helps contextualize this larger map, of grief, right? And the different faces of grief. Yeah, and the different roles that grief plays, as well as the different relationships we can have with grief. Yeah. I want to hear you talk about the offering, but before that, before we get more into the logistical land, I'm curious if there's anything else that kind of wants to be said in this more watery, big picture, mm,
Mm,
yeah,
mm,
perspective, or let me phrase it like this: is there a question that I haven't asked that you feel um you want to talk to, you want to speak to? Mm.
mm. Um, hmm. I don't know that there is, other than simply taking a moment for us all to express our gratitude to those who came before us,
Mm.
um, our ancestors, perhaps that are unnamed, or perhaps we do not see their faces in our mind, as well as those that we have pictures of on our altars.
Mm.
We make offerings to. Um, yeah, just wanting to honor honor the dead and the deceased.
Mhm.
Um, and sending, my prayers to the spirit world. Damn, that's a whole other conversation. Like the whole like process of like interacting with my father while he was like unconscious,
Mm.
and like the strangeness surrounding his death, and like the dreams that I was having. And, oh my gosh, I mean, that's a whole other thing, is talking about like these different ways of responding to death, and like trying to understand, like, where do we go when we
Mm.
die? Like,
Mm.
especially as somebody who comes from mixed lineages, like, there isn't,
Mhm.
or, kind of going back to your what you said about like these broken lineages. Like when we have these broken lineages and these mixed lineages, I feel like our understanding of where people go when they die fractures. And in my understanding and in my personal worldview, like there is no like one true place that we all go. I think that all kind of all spirit worlds and the world views that support them for different traditional cultures around the world, I feel like all of those exist simultaneously.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's so much variation in how people conceive of the spirit world and the passage to it that are diametrically opposed. Um, for some cultures, if you, um, yeah, there's just a lot of different, I was going to say something, but I think it would be a little bit triggering. But just that there's worldviews that, and cultural, context that reinforces those ideas of where people go when they pass on to the next life, or even if there is a next life. But, coming from my context, which is that, there is no one true place in my kind of mixed lineage and somewhat, opposing lineages at times. I kind of like watched my father really just be really disoriented. Also, to say that, like, watching somebody, unexpectedly, enter a surgery that, like, is relatively routine and then wake up. I think he woke up like 3 weeks later, and then even so was like, there's all these different drugs that they had him on and just like completely disoriented for those 2 months. When he passed, just having these dreams that reinforce this idea of like he was already outside of his body, and then being really upset about like, oh my god, like my father doesn't know that his body is dead, and just like so much confusion around that. I mean, it's just it is, I still don't know. I still don't know where we go when we die, and I think that is okay. But for some reason, I wanted to talk about that, or that wanted to be talked about, was just the death process. And like, yeah, like I said, having some very strange experiences that really confused me, right? Because even as like this kind of quote unquote very spiritual person, you think like where we go when we die. That's kind of the whole big point of like spirituality, right? And yet when you're confronted with like one of the most important people in your life passing away, um, I was just so worried that like him being in and out of consciousness, and like when he was awake, he was not himself. So it's just, just kind of feeling like all of this anxiety around like, is my father going to make it to the spirit world,
Yeah.
was very distressing. Um,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I'm not sure that that leaves us off at any good point. Maybe an open-ended question, but maybe
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah. Hmm. So my grandpa passed away last March.
Mhm.
And I remember this very clearly because Saturn had just moved into Pisces. And then my grandpa, as well as he was a Pisces sun. And that's something that we share in common
Oh,
from both my maternal grandparents are Pisces suns, actually. And so we're all like
interesting.
this little Pisces
Oh,
community. And he passed away. He was 87, I believe. So he was older. He
Mm,
passed away in his home, and I was actually in Indonesia, Marika. I
mm,
didn't get to see him. I was supposed to see him on Saturday morning, and Friday afternoon he passed away. And somehow, in me just saying that, I also want to recognize how grief is not just for the dead, but it's also grieving the changes of the structure of the living.
yeah.
Because I saw how it changed my mom's family line, right? Like suddenly my mom is at the top of the family line, right?
Mhm.
The she graduated from being a parent, an adult, to an elder.
Yeah.
And similar to you, I sit at this intersection, right, of different beliefs. You know,
Mhm.
my family, especially from that side, um, my grandfather was the one who actually brought us all to church. You know, and
Mm.
so he had a very specific idea of where he would go when he passed. I personally have more of an energy worldview, and I see that, you know,
Yeah.
we when we die we decompose and we shift into other forms in this on this earth, you know, and that nothing ever really leaves earth. That's my own personal cosmology.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um which also comes with its complications, you know? Because then nothing ever really leaves, you know, and what do we do with that information, right? But um yeah, I'm so aware of the intensity of that, you know, the intensity of these different ontologies and worldviews coexisting with one another, and how grief um, confronts us with that, right? Confronts us with the multiple perspectives. And I think that confrontation with the multiple perspectives is almost more challenging, you know, because then we don't know, right? And what do we do with the things that we don't know? We get afraid of it, you know, and it can bring up fear. And so, yeah, again, I don't know if that leaves us in in an unfinished note, but I do think that's something that grief certainly brings up. Yeah,
Yeah.
question of like what's next, right?
Mhm.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just so deeply cherish and appreciate your presence and your wisdom and your work. Thank you for being here. Mhm.
Hey, Jonathan.